If you're not mad about ads, and that's fair enough, choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts, and you can hear this podcast in all its glory without the ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time, and we have a huge body of work to get through today, John. We're going to talk about management.
Oh, I don't like the way you say that, Mac. A body of work. Oh, no, not for me. A
body of work to get through. We have. But you know what, John? I'm still part of my European tour at the moment. Good. I am in Somerset. I actually realised I'm actually in Glastonbury, but I'm a week late.
Oh, you're there for the tidy up, are you?
I'm there for the tidy up. I'm there for the plastic bottles. I was walking past a place called Shepton Mallet last night, John.
Oh, yes, sounds great.
Deepest Somerset. And I don't know if you ever saw Translations by Brian Freely.
I did, yes.
The play,
yeah.
Right? And there was a really fascinating moment. So basically, two Brits are sent over to Donegal to do a geometric survey of Donegal for the British standard map-making outfits and the British Army. And, of course, the Brits are intrigued by our Irish names, like, you know, Dundrum, Dunleary for Irish names for, and they found them really weird. And the Irish lad says, yeah, but what about names like Shepton Mallet, right? And you can imagine
Weston Supermare.
Exactly. If you're from the Gaeltacht in Donegal, these names sound so bizarre to you. Anyway, but by the way, actually, if you ever get the chance to see Brian Freel's Translations, an amazing, amazing play. And it's all about things that get lost in translations, where cultures meet each other, where cultures overlap upon each other, and where just the way in which we're brought up in various different cultures shadows or changes the way in which we actually see the world. It's well worth seeing. One of the great comes from that, you know, that amazing school in Derry that produced so many, I think it's called St. Columns.
Right.
So it produced Brian Freel, John Hume, Seamus Heaney, all at the same time, all in the same class.
Were they in the same class?
Two Nobel Prize winners in the same bloody class. It's an amazing school. I mean, the list is as long as your arm, not mine, which, as you know, as being a lanky fella, is very long, but it's an amazing place. Anyway, I am here in, and do you know what I'm marveling at, John? Is the colour of buildings here in Somerset. They use an amazing honey kind of coloured limestone. Have you ever noticed that in England?
That's a type of sandstone, though, isn't it?
Well, you know, I did a bit of research on it. And it's a stone from a place called Ham Hill, John. And Ham Hill in Yeovil in Somerset. This is my latest thing. Stone masonry. Masonry. You know, when you wake up in England, this part of England is very, very, very lush. Very
gorgeous, gorgeous.
And we're actually going to talk about, in the management thing, we're also going to talk a little bit about English mismanagement, right?
Right.
Because Thames Water, right, has gone bust. How does a public utility go bust?
But this was one of Thatcher's great projects, wasn't it? To privatise all these utilities.
To privatise everything.
Yeah.
So she privatised the waters, right? Imagine it.
I remember the day it went private, actually.
Did you crack open a bottle of champagne in Fulham where you were living? Put on your red braces.
Yeah. I had cider like you down the West Country.
Oh, the cider, it actually is very good down here. It is very good. And the accents are great. I mean, they think we speak funny. They should hear themselves. Hilarious. Anyway, but I want to talk to you about management in general. And I want to focus first on the RTE carry-on. Right?
Oh, don't get me started.
Saga, whatever. And how the lack of any financial controls in the state bleeds into inflation in the rest of the country. Because I'm trying to explain, a week ago, before this broke, a statistic came out from the EU that said that Ireland is the most expensive country in Europe. Not in the EU, not in the Western Europe, in the whole of Europe, right?
Right.
Now, Irish people listening to this will understand that. And the question is, how can you be in a rich country? How can you live in a rich country and still feel poor? I mean, this is one of the dilemmas that many people ask me, even on the street, like, how do you explain? And what I'm going to do today, John, is I'm going to link the RTE salary carry-on to the rate of inflation through the mechanism of the state not being able to control its own costs. And the reason the state is so hugely, hugely important, is the state is still the biggest buyer of everything in Ireland. Every country. The state is 30%. If you think like state spending is 30%, 40% of GDP. So, it's a huge part. So if the state can't control its spending at the higher and lower end, it bleeds into the rest of the cost base of the economy.
Right.
But what I'm not going to do, John, is point the finger all at the public sector, because it also happens hugely in the private sector. I'm going to use the Thames Water example in England of what happens in the private sector when greedy gobshites get hold of a utility and they extract money out of the utility all the time. I'm going to explain how the whole thing works. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you, John, about the Wimbledon model of economics, because Wimbledon is starting this week, John.
Yes, it is.
Right.
I used to love Wimbledon. We lived in Wimbledon, actually, for quite a few years when I moved to London first. Loved living there. Yeah.
And it's very lush and green.
It was gorgeous. Yeah. I mean, there's Wimbledon Town and Wimbledon Village. But during the tennis week, it was just full of the beautiful people.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the pubs were full. It was just always
Punnets of strawberries and deuce.
Yes.
And 30 love and all that stuff.
Whipped cream, the whole lot.
But John, what I'm going to explain to you is how Ireland is the Wimbledon economy. So think about Wimbledon, right?
Without the beautiful people.
But exactly, the beautiful, although you should see the state of the pair of us this morning. I believe you were on a lad's lunch yesterday, John.
Yes, a very extended lunch.
An extended lunch. It was a lunch involving buckets of red wine.
Buckets of red wine and talking absolute bollocks all day.
Well, bollocks. Well, it's red wine just fuels bollocks. Yeah. But the reason I'm going to talk about Wimbledon, the final bit of the podcast today, is going to be, think about Wimbledon, right? The Brits host Wimbledon. It's one of the great tennis tournaments of the world, except no Brits ever do well in it.
Yeah.
So what they do...
Apart from Andy Murray.
So think of this, but I mean, every now and then,
yes,
right?
Yeah,
every now and then.
True.
But they host the best. So basically, it's a way of looking at the economy, right? Think about hosting the best companies in the world. So Ireland is the Wimbledon economy. Mm-hmm. We host all these brilliant companies, but very few Irish companies compete at that level. And the reason this is important to keep in the back of your head as a model for the economy is when we get to the end of this podcast, what I'll try to explain is how the RTE salaries leaking into the cost base of the country, as emblematic of, not specifically, but emblematic of, means the economy moves more and more towards the Wimbledon model. And by that I mean small Irish businesses, which have to be the backbone of every economy, get elbowed out when the cost base rises.
Yeah.
And only those businesses that have a massive tax arbitrage game going on, which is the multinationals, can survive. So the reason this is important is not just it impacts inflation, the cost of living, which is absolutely crucial, but also it impacts on the ability of the Irish domestic sector to grow at a time when our cost base goes out of kilter, which is why the Ryan Tubridy and Dee Forbes and Noel Kelly, right?
Yep.
And all the rest of them, right? All their salaries has a manifest and material impact into the overall economy and everyone's life. So it's not just about getting indignant about who gets paid what, right?
Yeah.
It's actually drawing the links between that and economic performance and the exchange rate or the lack of the exchange rate and expenditure and inflation and the economic model.
That's really good. But perhaps we should actually start with, for people who are not familiar with this RTE saga, a quick explanation on that.
Okay. So John and I both worked at RTE.
Yes, we did.
I presented an afternoon chat show on RTE called The Big Bite, which was a total laugh. I tell you, it was one of the best jobs I ever had. Because we were doing 4 shows a week, we had to cover everything.
Yeah.
So you'd be interviewing politicians on the one hand, and then talking to transgender somebody on the other hand, then talking to Alwins down the country about something, then up to Northern Ireland. It was great fun.
Did you have a little cooking segment in it as well? All those shows always have a little cooking segment.
I should have done that. I could have actually progressed past this.
You missed the trick.
I could have progressed past the scrambled eggs and toast approach to my fine colouring menu, right? But anyway, so John was a sound engineer in RTE, so we know the place, and
there are tales to tell.
Just let's say everything that has been revealed about RTE management does not shock us. Is that fair to say, John?
Absolutely. Yeah, don't get me started because my blood was boiling all week.
So just so you know, RTE is the public broadcaster in Ireland, right?
It's the BBC.
And it's the BBC, except it operates in all Irish things as a hybrid model. So the BBC and many, many public broadcasters only get their money from the state. in a license fee, and there is no advertising. RTE, in a classic Schlevene Irish move, manages to get money from the state and gets money from advertisers.
Yeah.
So it should be the most well-financed public broadcast company in the world. But it is always broke, right? So how do you actually reconcile these two things, right? So what you normally have is if you've got a totally private company, raises money for advertising, has cost control, tries to make a profit. Or you have a totally public sector company, gets all its money from the state, has some cost control, tries to give dividends back to the shareholders, which is the state, right? Yeah. RTE, on the other hand, gets money from everywhere, makes bollocks of cost control, and is always bust.
Yeah.
So this is the background. So that's the company. Now, the way they do it is they pay their talent rather than being PAYE employees, which they should be, given that they work exclusively for one company, the state broadcaster. They have all decided to set up companies so that they are companies rather than employees.
Yes.
And then on top of that, you have the situation whereby the main talent, the main presenters act and negotiate through an agent, which is not unusual.
Yeah.
But what makes it unusual here, John, is that there's only one buyer, which is the state company.
Yeah. And there's only one agent as well. And he manages all of the top guys in RTE. And so he basically holds the purse strings and the power in RTE.
Right. And so he goes in, and his big threat, which is entirely bogus.
Yeah.
And so he says, my geniuses, who are uniquely talented, unbelievably talented, nobody else in the whole world can do it, right? My ma could present the Late Late. I'm really serious, yeah. Right? Or any of those shows, right?
Alice would make a brilliant presenter.
Not only are they uniquely talented, but outside RTE, there is a vibrant media landscape just ready to pick up these talents if you don't pay them an extraordinary amount.
Yeah.
But we know that's not the case.
Yeah. The dogs of the street know it's not the case.
Exactly. But the RTE management are so supine and servile and appalling with the way in which they deal with public money that they have always bent over and paid up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, this scandal is due to another company being set up in the UK where monies were funneled into that company for consultancy when they were actually going in to pay Ryan Tubridy's wages.
Yeah. And
then, of course, the question is everyone looks at all the various different things. So that's that. If you've been living outside of Ireland, none of this makes sense to you. If you've been living in Ireland, you must have been under a stone for the last 10 days not to know.
So what happened in this particular case was that RTE went on a big cost-cutting spree a few years ago with lots of redundancies, closures and pay cuts and all the rest. And in fairness, all the top presenters took their 10 or 15% pay cuts, or so we thought. And they made a big deal out of it at the time, including Ryan Tubridy. But in actual fact, it turns out that he actually negotiated a secret top-up payment through a London-based company from an RTE slush fund.
Okay, that's the whole thing. And the person involved in this is a woman called Dee Forbes, who was the Director General.
Yeah, and they hung her out to dry because they're spineless gits.
Oh, yeah.
It also turns out that they were giving ad clients huge sweeteners worth hundreds of thousands, all taxpayers' money.
As Bertie used to describe it, a sweetheart deal, John. Right?
So essentially, Mac, this is not the usual Late Late Show shite of one for everyone in the audience. This is 345 grand extra for Ryan.
All right, so that's the scenario.
Yeah.
But the reason this is important is the following. Well, there's many reasons it's important, and let's other people get shouting and roaring about this. I mean, on the presenters, all I say is they're made good because of the audience they inherit from the company that is RTE. It's a largely static business. That's why one should always be very skeptical about equating them to their audience.
Yeah.
Their audience was delivered to them, right? So that's the whole thing. That's what's going on in the background. But the key issue, John, is if a state has an inability to manage its costs, and if a state pisses other people's money up against the wall, we have a serious problem. So we're going to call it fiscal incontinence, John.
Right, okay.
This may well be, you know that there's a very well-known adage in public speaking that middle-aged men should never get up in public and speak with chinos on.
Right. I didn't know that.
Because of stains and leaks. Okay?
Oh, I see.
This is
Okay.
yes.
I'm just as you
just
say
keep
it, I'm
that-
just checking my chinos now.
Exactly. Just keep that image of incontinence in your head, John. Okay. So imagining this sort of leaking that happens in the cost base. So,
Okay.
for example, it's that idea of, the urinary tract disorder
Yes.
that middle-aged men get. Well, this is a pecuniary tract disorder that middle-aged companies get. Okay.
Right.
So just keep that in your head.
Okay.
So they keep leaking money, right?
Yeah.
And what happens is when they leak money, because the state is so big, this pushes up cost pressures everywhere else in the country. So the link, John, in this podcast is between the state's inability to exercise cost control and the general rate of inflation, which has been building since 2001. And I'm going to do a little bit of economic theory here, right?
Right.
The reason 2001 is important is that's the last year we used the punt, our own currency.
Right.
And we joined the euro. So when you're in a small open economy, inflation comes through largely through the exchange rate. So I'll explain that to you, right? So when a small country has an exchange rate, the exchange rate is the most important price in the market, right? Everything else is secondary.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the exchange rate prices imports. And small open economies like Ireland have a massive, massive amount of imports and a massive amount of exports. So the exchange rate is the price. So what happens basically, if the economy is growing, if the Irish economy is growing faster than other economies, right? Demand in the economy is growing. What will happen is the rate of inflation will begin to tick upwards.
Yeah.
Then the central bank in that country will raise interest rates. By raising interest rates, what they will do is they will increase the exchange rate relative to other exchange rate. So the exchange rate of that small country goes up. When the exchange rate of that small country goes up, the price of imports go down. So imported inflation goes down, and that's how the economy adjusts from high to low inflation through the exchange rate.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Which is why
Makes
giving
sense.
up your exchange rate, which we did by joining the euro, is of huge consequence to the way you run the economy. So you have to do a totally mental shift between the way in which you run the economy with an exchange rate and the way in which you run an economy in a monetary union.
And the whole central bank has a different function then in the economy.
The central bank has a completely different function, but much more importantly, the entire government apparatus, so the central bank, the Department of Finance, all the big departments of state need to understand that the discipline imposed by the exchange rate is gone.
Yeah.
So you have this discipline that the exchange rate basically prices, and you can use the exchange rate to actually protect yourself in a very significant way against inflation outside by raising your rate of interest and raising your exchange rate. Once you lose that ability, you have to actually do a mental jump, right? And say, okay, we've lost the discipline of the exchange rate. So what anchors inflation in the country? Now, this is hugely important for Ireland because Ireland, when we joined the euro, went from having inflation and a cost of living around the average European level to now being the most expensive country. So what happened, and what's the link to the exchange rate, and what's the link to RTE?
Yeah.
Right? This is our question,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So the link is the following, right? When you don't have an exchange rate, you need to impose discipline on the economy in some other way. How you do that is you impose discipline on government spending. Not the actual quantum of government spending, because you still have to build roads and bridges and internets and right? You'll build all that, right? But the value for money.
Yeah.
So that every single piece of government expenditure is examined, interrogated, and everything makes sense. If the state loses the ability to interrogate its own spending because of fiscal incontinence and the leakages we were talking about, what you get is that the public sector unmoors the economy from its anti-inflationary bias, and you get an expanding cost of living crisis, which is what we have in Ireland.
Right.
So therefore, 20 years ago, we should have had a total mindset shift in the way economics is discussed here. But we didn't. So we joined the euro and said, don't worry, we don't have to change anything. Now, of course, what happens over time is that every single time there's a cost overrun, or every single time a presenter gets paid a fortune, and every single time, for example, a manager in the top of the civil servants gets paid, what this all bleeds into wage inflation, and this bleeds into the overall level of prices.
Yeah.
And just fascinatingly, so for example, the reason the presenters are interesting because at least it's a public thing you can look at, right? If you take the salaries of the main players in this, like Tuberty, Joe Duffy, Claire Byrne, Miriam McCallaghan, la la la. If you look at their salaries, Tuberty's like 500 grand or something. Joe Duffy's 350 grand. Claire Byrne, 280 grand. Ray Darcy, 250 grand. Brendan O'Connor, 245 grand. Okay, if you take all these salaries and you compare them to the salaries of presenters in Danish public broadcasting. And the reason I picked Denmark is Denmark is the same size as us. It's a population of 5 million. So therefore, the economies of scale when it comes to advertising and public spending should be more or less the same.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you contrast, in Denmark, their presenters on the public TV station have a salary range between 68 grand and 120 tops.
Right.
Tops.
Okay. Right. Okay.
And our guys are getting 500 grand.
Yeah.
And now you can see, so if you're that lackadaisical with public money, you're going to be lackadaisical everywhere. And so the economic theory tells us without an exchange rate, you've got to be really, really on the ball. Interestingly, the Danes kept their exchange rate. Denmark is the only country, or the only two countries in Western Europe, the Danes and the Swedes, who didn't join the euro.
Well,
right?
actually, that's a question I want to ask you there, then, is like, well, two questions. Should we have joined the euro when we did?
Big question.
Big question, I know. And also, has this fiscal incontinence occurred in other countries joined to the euro?
Not to the same extent. No. So if you look at, Germany and France and all this, you don't see the same level of public expenditure going out of whack, out of control. So basically, it's because we decided, rather than re-examine our entire way of looking at the world, we decided we just join the euro and let's see how it goes, right? Okay. So what I'm saying is economic decisions are crucially important. This is the point. You can't just give up your exchange rate.
Right. Okay.
So then the best thing is, so if you look at since the euro and you look at the rate of inflation here, and think about the rate of inflation as the cost of living, and you look at how it has evolved, and you look at how we've gone from being the average European country in terms of cost of living to the most expensive, what you see is the role of the state enormously. So I'll give you some figures, John, right? In the past 20 years, since we joined the euro, the CPI index, consumer price index, has increased by 48.4%, or around 2.2% per annum every year, right?
Yep.
However, when you break down the rate of inflation into its component parts, what you see is a massive disparity between the rate of inflation in those sectors where the government is present and the rate of inflation in those sectors where the government is absent. So if you take, for example, water, electricity, housing, that area, that has increased by 159%. So 3 times the rate of inflation.
Okay.
Education has increased by 121%. So over 2 times the average rate of inflation. Booze and fags has increased by 100%, again, over 2 times. And health by 78%, which is, increasing dramatically over the average. So then the question is, what is the common denominator in all those sectors? Common denominator is the biggest buyer is the state.
Yes. Okay.
So you can see is that the areas where the state is doing the buying, where the state controls the market, so housing, the price of land, supply of land, absolutely. You have booze and fags is all taxation, right? It's all taxation. Health provided by the state, education provided by the state. In those areas, there's no cost control. And if you contrast this with other areas of inflation, so for example, clothing, footwear, furniture, household appliances, consumer electronics, things that people spend lots of money on. What you see is in those areas, Irish prices are in line or even slightly lower than the EU average. So think about that, right?
Okay, right. So there's something afoot.
So the areas where the state is involved, you get this massive fiscal incontinence. The area where the state isn't involved, we're in line with the average. So you have to conclude that what we're seeing at RTE is emblematic of the state not being able to control its own costs. And why? Because it's not its fucking money. It's spending other people's money, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people will know this, but it's important to put it all the way down. If you look at, for example, the overruns in state expenditure here in Ireland, right? So, for example, you have a budget, you say, okay, this is going to cost you X, and then it costs Y. Look, the National Children's Hospital, John.
Oh,
right?
Jesus, that's
Initially,
another one
the
that boils
estimate-
my blood. Like, it really
But
does.
initially, the estimate was 670 million, right?
Yeah.
The project is 72% complete. They've already spent 1.1 billion. So we're talking about overruns of 100%.
Yeah.
Which is phenomenal. It's expected it'll go to 1.4 billion. And the costs just keep rising.
And nobody seems to be accountable.
And nobody's accountable. The Lewis was initially supposed to cost 200 million and be completed by 2001. It ended up costing 800 million and was finished in 2004.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a proposal for the Lewis in Cork. They've already spent 1.4 million and overspent already on just talking about the bleeding thing.
Talk ain't cheap, Mac. Talk ain't cheap.
Talk ain't cheap, as we know, John. Also, Dublin Port Tunnel, the initial cost overrun on Dublin Port Tunnel was meant to be 450 million. It was overrun by 300 million, right?
It's outrageous.
And the HSE, which is receiving 21 billion from the state, the HSE is already running a deficit of 1.6 billion over that 21 billion that was supposed to be its budget.
So
okay?
this
seeps all into costs. This drives up costs. And then people have to say, well, I want higher wages because I just need to live.
Yeah, exactly. So this comes down to a lack of expertise and management, which I think we should talk about a little bit more after this.
Absolutely.
So, Mac, we have, as you just listed out there, we've these massive overspends on the Lewis and the Children's Hospital and this and that and almost every...
And the difference between the Danish presenters and the RTE presenters being the absolute example of this.
So this is down to, as you say, a lack of expertise and or just pure bad management and a bit of naivety and all the rest. Explain this a bit more.
So now we're going to talk about the manager, John. Now, it's always been a bit of a term of abuse in the English-speaking world, like, oh, your man or your one, they're middle management, right?
Yeah.
It's always been something like a cliche, right? You'd never want to be the lad walking around with the 3 coloured pens in the top of his white suit.
Your chinos.
Okay, exactly, in your chinos, your red pen, your blue pen, your black pen, right? You don't want to be that bloke, right? There's always been this slagging of management. They haven't got talent, etc. Now, I would beg to differ. I think that management is an amazing skill.
Yeah.
Now, I go back to Napoleon, John.
Oh.
I go back to Napoleon, right? Napoleon was obsessed with management. And Napoleon introduced the Sciences Po in France, this entire education system, this haute école education system, to create a managerial class to run the country.
Right, okay.
To allow the French to do their big projet and their grand projet, their big project. Now, the point was he understood that without management and an explicitly brilliant managerial class, it doesn't matter how much talent you have and how many ideas you have and how much flamboyance you have, you're always going to be undermined, right?
Yeah.
So the management class is an absolutely crucial class that our education system, of course, doesn't cater for. It doesn't train people to be managers. So what we get in the English-speaking world, Ireland being very much representative of this, is management is given as a reward for performance in other areas.
Yes.
Right? And I noticed this when I worked in London years ago in the banking world, right? You might get, like, say, a foreign exchange trader who was really brilliant at making money out of foreign exchange. So they're traders, they're hustlers, right? They make loads of money and then suddenly they become the boss of the trading exchange.
Yes.
So now they've got to manage other traders, but they don't have that skill set. They don't want to do it.
But
they want to make money.
That's
what their job is.
Yeah,
right?
and this is I agree with you entirely, because this is something that I saw both in the BBC and particularly in RTE. It's absolutely endemic. You know, these places are full of lifers, guys who go in after college, after school, whatever, and they're there for life with the pensions, the whole lot. But they go in as creative or technical staff, engineers or researchers that go on to be producers. And then they get to, the top of their game. And some of them are good. Some of them aren't so good, whatever. But the only place to go then for them is into management, which they're not trained for. And they also end up managing their mates. So one day
so
their
they can't say
colleagues,
no.
So, and this is where this incontinence comes from, I would imagine.
You're absolutely right. And to go back to Napoleon had a great expression about governance. So management and governance are the same thing, right? And Napoleon said, to govern is to choose. It's an amazing expression, right? So basically, governing anything, you have to make choices. Yes or no.
Yeah.
No, you can't have that. It's like dealing with children. No, you cannot have your rattle. So when Ryan Tuberty's agent comes in and says, I'm going to throw this out of the pram, you say, well, fuck off, throw it out of the pram.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
But if you're managing your mates, as you say, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So what you have then, the first thing is, so the reward structure in companies jaundices manage away from proper management and into talent or rewards for other abilities, which are in management. That's the first thing. And the second, and it's not just the private sector, the public sector, it's the private sector, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have a management class that is actually extremely good at managing resources, right? What you get is you get people who look completely out of their depth. So, for example, the chief financial officer of because they are out of their depth, right? The chief financial officer of RTE saying, your man says, how much do you earn? He says, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he was a joke. He was a joke.
But the fellow who's actually meant to hold the purse strings, not knowing how much money is coming in and out and how much he owns, right? So this is a great example. That's the first thing about management, right? Is that it is a profession that has been undermined in the English-speaking world, number one. Number two is the financialization of the economy. And this is a really important point. And this brings me back to Thames Water and brings me back to a huge amount of scandals, is that when you link management to something like a share price or something like a top line performance, what you will always get is managers cutting costs in order to ingratiate themselves to the bottom line and in order to make money. So I'll give you the example of Thames Water, right? What basically happened in Thames Water, right? You have a utility, so you're producing water, so you're charging for water, so it should be a really simple business. You make sure that your costs are X, your revenues are Y, that's fine.
Yeah.
They start with absolutely no debt. But because a utility, and this goes down, do you remember all the Irish water and all that sort of stuff about privatizing, right? Yeah. Because a utility throws off a stream of income every single year, whether you're producing gas or you're producing water or you're producing electricity, you have a stream of income, right? So that stream of income is constant. When interest rates fall dramatically, as they did in the last 20 years, right, that stream of income can be used to pay more and more and more debt.
Yeah.
So that attracts into this business, and this is huge for the whole global economy, debt buyout operators. So what they do is when the company is privatized, it's owned by shareholders, right? These debt buyout guys come in and they buy the entire company using debt.
Yeah.
And so they lumber the company with enormous amounts of debt, which all can be paid in the good times by the stream of income, which is the revenues from water. But that's all predicated on two things. One is the stream of income coming from water, being able to go up all the time, i.e. you could increase the water charges. And two, the rate of interest remaining very, very low so you can service the debt.
Yeah.
Now, what has happened in Thames Water and what has happened all over the world is the rate of interest has gone from 0 to 5. Suddenly that debt is much greater. The repayments on that debt are much greater. And going back to the market, trying to roll over the debt is much more expensive than the stream of income coming from providing water. And the companies go bust. But they go bust not because the companies are bad, but because the financial engineering driven by the new management, who aren't managers, they're just actually mafiosi profit heisters, destroys the company. So you have a crazy situation in England where the water companies bust, not because the water company can't provide water, but because it's being used as a junket for financiers to extract income out of the company. And all they're doing, John, is the amazing thing is, right, they're increasing debt. So they're borrowing loads of money. Let's say they borrow 100 million. And what they do then is they massively increase the dividends to the shareholders. But the problem is the shareholders are only themselves because they've just bought the company. So basically the company ends up being almost like a rinse and repeat operation for the extraction of value. And at the end of the day, it goes bust. But those guys are living in the Cayman Islands and they don't give a fuck, right? They've got out, they've got their money, right?
Yeah.
So think about, so it's not just the RTE ridiculously poor management. there is something going on in the global environment of financialization in the private sector, plus very, very poor cost controls in the public sector. And of course, who pays for everything? The consumer.
Yeah.
Because all these costs are passed on to the consumer, right? And that's exactly where we are now. And then finally, what you see then is this extraordinary increase in the rate of inflation progressively over time in those parts of the economy where either the public sector can't control it or private sector bandits driven by financialization come in and gouge the companies. All the while, the rate of inflation rises, people's sense of their take-home wage falls, and you get this ridiculous situation where we have in Ireland, which is you have a rich country, but everybody feels poor.
Yeah.
And that's where we're getting to. And the final part of this is back to our Wimbledon conversation, John, which is in an economy which is driven by rapacious managers who are very bad at their jobs because there's no managerial legacy, no managerial inheritance, no managerial tradition. So you're just promoting people willy-nilly who have no abilities in that specific area. And management could be boring, but it's about how do you use your resources in the best possible way.
Yeah.
So what happens then is that as the rate of inflation rises and the costs rise and wages rise and the cost of materials rise, et cetera, small businesses who are, John, our heroes in this podcast, don't forget.
Always are, Mike, always are.
Yeah, they always are because we're a small business.
Yes.
That's why. No, but seriously, small businesses then can't compete for talent because the talent has been driven up, the wages of the talent, as we see in the RTE case, even though we're not too sure that they're really talented.
Yeah.
But then what happens is the small companies that need to be able to compete for resources, for rents, for talent, for finance, they get elbowed out. And only big companies, right, that in the case of Ireland are multinationals who have a tax arbitrage game, right, only they can survive in this incredibly expensive country. And increasingly then the economy becomes more and more and more dependent on them.
Yeah.
And less opportunistic for our own people. And that's the sort of Wimbledon model, where you have this great tournament, but no Brits in it.
Yeah.
So Ireland is a great economy, but no paddies in it, right? No paddy businesses.
Yes.
Because the businesses are all the foreign talent. And that's, I think, as I decide to go down, maybe have
another Scrumpy Jack.
Cider. They've much better names than Scrumpy Jack, Down in Somerset. Now, John, just as a little thinking ahead for listeners, we've done the European economy, we've talked about the British economy, we've talked about the Irish economy. On Thursday, we're going to talk about the big one, the German economy, and what is going on in Germany. Because what is going on in Germany is the most important question for what is going on in Europe. So we will be leaving Somerset, we will be double backing to Berlin, and then that's the end of the summer travels. Okay? So we'll talk Germany in a couple of days' time.
Fantastic.
See you then.